G'day Shakers and Groovers, how are you going today? But first I just wanted to show you outside. I'm here at my old office. The dishwasher's going there. And I'm doing a bit of cleaning because of course I'm moving out of here. And but I just wanted to show you what's going on. So, see that really big building there? That big building used to be like this. Nothing, just a car park. Now, it's a big building. Things are a-changing. It's spring. It's a beautiful day. It's starting to get warm, and so it's been 4 weeks since I made my first film, the Nikon Z. It's a big deal, and everybody was reasonably happy about that, although there were quite a number of people who thought it's not a big deal at all. We're all allowed to have our own opinions. Then I made, 2 weeks later, a follow-up film, which was, I'm going to change from my A7R III to the Nikon Z7. And again, whew, so much negativity on that one. Even so, my use case is very specific. But I don't really want to talk about that. I mostly want to talk about the camera industry and the fact that these sort of iterative, long-term, 3 to 5 years, getting up to speed is very normal. And I have a feeling a lot of people who are now hobbyists, semi-pros, and even some pros these days, they've never been through a transition like this before because they only started in the digital era, in the full-frame digital era. And for those that started in the full-frame digital era, man, you've seen nothing when it comes to change, growing pains, disappointments, and things that took years to fix. And I'm not an apologist for Nikon, and now Canon, considering the specifications of their new camera. I think something else is going on with Canon. I'm a realist, and the reality is, these things don't happen overnight. They just simply cannot. You cannot, in the case of a company like Nikon, take into account the past, the present, and the future like they're having to do. They've got to take in 50, 60 years of past. They've got to take in today, how are their users going to transition, and then they've got to take into account the future, and they've got to create something that lasts the next 100 years, as they have said. And there's an expectation that you can answer all of those questions in one go, all at once, with 1 or 2 cameras. It's silly to expect that that's going to be able to happen. It's just silly. And I'm pretty amazed by the responses that have come from people not realizing the history that's there. I'm amazed. And the second thing is, not only is it silly, but it's not going to happen. Because as a company, they've got to move forward, they've got to test the waters, they've got to see what people like, they've got to see how people behave, what they think. And secondly, the Z mount is amazing. And in the 4 weeks since this camera was launched, and the specs became known, and the opinions started to happen, in those 4 weeks, we've actually learned a lot more about this camera. I want to mostly talk about the industry. Let's talk expectations. Can we talk expectations? I want to talk expectations. I've still photographed on film just more as a professional than I've photographed on digital. And then the digital transition began. And you know, it came in spurts and splutters. Apple did their quick take cameras way too early. They were like 1 megapixel, 640 by 480 or something crazy. Very expensive. They came, they went. Kodak did some cool things. I've still got all these cameras. 1.7 megapixels cost me $2,000. And then it was Kodak who put Kodak internals inside a Nikon body and created this digital camera experience. But it was, here in this country, it was $20,000 or $30,000. It was like maybe 2 or 3 megapixels. It was an SLR format, but the thing, instead of being this tall, was like this tall. But then Nikon, in 2004, announced the D70. And this was a game changer. It was a crop sensor. So we suddenly had this thing called crop sensor. What the hell is crop sensor all about? But it was a digital camera. It was 6 megapixels, and it was amazing. We suddenly, you know, I experimented with Kodak digital, Sony digital. It was called the F707 or something crazy, 3 megapixel. But Nikon brought this camera out. It was about $2,000, $2,500 here with a lens, a kit lens that went with it. I could put all my old f-mount glass on it. Suddenly I was in the digital game. It was 6 megapixels and it was usable. It was workable. I could use it just because at that point in time, film was still better than digital. The D3s came out, and that's when digital was better than film. So my whole point is, this transition from film to digital being as good as film coughed and spluttered from the late 90s until the late noughties. It took a decade. It took a decade. And in the middle of it, we had just the first digitals that were kind of, I suppose you'd call them pocket cameras. And then we had things like the D70, which was a cropped sensor, which none of us liked. It wasn't that great. And then it took another few years. From 2004, there was the awful camera, which I spent $9,000 on. Awful Nikon, the D2X. Really was a terrible. It was cropped censored. It was $9,000. It was a pro camera. It was 12 megapixels. And you couldn't shoot it over 800 ISO. It was just an ocean, a snowstorm of noise. So in the camera industry, we know this iteration pain, going from the first digitals to crop sensor digitals to full frame digitals was a 10-year experience. So it's so important to me that everybody out there who doesn't have that history, if you've gotten into photography in the last 10 years, you haven't had that history. You haven't seen that history. You haven't seen the growing pains that professionals have had to go through. Do I move to digital? Will cropped sensor digital be good enough? Is 6 megapixels going to be good enough in my crop sensor camera? No, it's not. Well, should we move to 12? You know, on and on. There's been all these questions that went from about 1997, 98, 99, 2000 through to, like I said, 2008 when the Nikon D3 came out, and finally it said, yes, I'm better. I'm better than film. That we have now the announcement of the Z7, the Nikon Zs. It's a very exciting announcement. It's a big deal. It's a super big deal. 50 or 60 years Nikon's been laboring over the F-mount and making it continue to work for us right up until this day, with the Nikon D850 being lightning fast, commensurate with its Canon brothers and sisters in the photo game. They've done it. They've made it work for us. But now Nikon had to make a really complicated decision of supporting the past, supporting the present, and supporting the future. How do you make sure all those 100 million, I think the number was, 100 million F lenses are supported in one way or another? Even the ones that you have to manually focus are still supported. And the ones from the last 20 years that have all got motors in them, from what we're hearing today, they're working pretty much, or are working the same as if they were on an F-mount camera. Now that is a massive achievement. And again, I thought that was going to be the case because I made this film here about the Nikon 1s and where the F lenses with this very simple adapter were working like a charm. You just have to look at the evidence. Nikon had been experimenting for years with this stuff and trying to get it right, and they had, and they did it. My main point from today's film is take into account that the camera industry has had to make these epic changes, and they can take years, if not a decade. And that's okay, and that's normal, and people like me who've been around a long time and have seen this stuff before just go, yeah, that's fine. So really, you know, what do I leave you with? The other thing I had a gripe with of late is this notion that that Nikon was overhyping things. I just don't think it's true. And I am very, very confident Nikon have not exposed what their full plans are for this Z mount. They just haven't done it. Knowing Canon was coming to market, and knowing that Sony wants to know everything they're doing so they can copy them and beat them, knowing all that, why would Nikon expose the next chapter this early? They're just simply not going to do it. They are not going to expose it this early. There's no necessity to. There's enough people like me who want to stick with Nikon, who are interested in what's going on here, to get this first iteration of devices out there working, tested, understood. Everybody does it. Apple does this, Samsung do this. You know, the Apple AirPods, the first version of them, really, you know, are they the best thing in the world? No, but they're great and they do it and it's competent. There's lots of things I don't like about it. Am I an early adopter? Yes. Am I using them? Yes. Am I happy with them? Yes. Do they work? Yes. Could they do some things better? Yes. Does that make them terrible? Not at all. They're great. So, I don't know, what are people's expectations? What are your expectations? But I can tell you, Nikon are not going to expose everything they're going to do in this space with the Z mount. They're not going to do it. They're not going to do it. There was a reason why 2021 was empty, because that's a couple of years away, and they don't want to expose that just yet. It gives their competition time to do what they're doing. They'll tell us 6 months out. Thank you so much for watching. I would love you to subscribe. I'm very passionate about photography. I'm very passionate about technology. I'm very passionate about what you want to do. What do you want to do? What's your use case? What's your scenario? Anyway, enough from me. Thank you so much. See you next time, people.